Tecovas is the go-to for premium, handcrafted Western boots. Stop by any store location for a warm welcome, a cold drink in hand, and a truly one-of-a-kind shopping experience. Let our friendly staff help you find your new go-to boots, whether your first pair or your 50th. Finish things off with a complimentary boot brand to make them extra special. Come for the boots, stay for the good times. Tecovas, forever West.
Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Tom Lyons, one of the founders of the 2430 Group and a former CIA Directorate of Operations officer, about Chinese spying and intellectual property theft and what can be done about it. And then we break down the latest on the Iran war, Chinese AI companies using satellites to track American troops, and the Space Force's preparation for potential orbital combat. And then Threat Status Director Jason Sickels joins the show for a very special announcement. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined this week by Vaughn Cockayne on the show. And Vaughn has been tracking the U.S. Iran war about as closely as anybody in Washington, and so we're excited to talk about that, of course, on the show this week. And later, Guy Taylor and I will have an exclusive interview with Tom Lyons, a former CIA Directorate of Operations officer, about Chinese IP theft and spying. So a really fascinating deep dive on that subject coming up later in the show. And then Threat Status Director Jason Sickels will be here with a special announcement about a major upcoming Threat Status event. So stay tuned for that. But Vaughn, first things first, as always, before we get to any of that, what's on your radar right now?
Hi, Ben. Thanks. Glad to be here. So obviously this week, as you said, I've been tracking a lot of the Iran stuff, and we're about to end another week with a lot of talk about diplomacy, but not a lot of public progress toward a comprehensive peace deal. Trump, shockingly, over the weekend, canceled a diplomatic mission at the last second to Islamabad, Pakistan, which would have featured J.D. Vance, the vice president, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, was apparently in Pakistan waiting for this U.S. mission before it was canceled, and launched his own diplomatic tour in response, and has since visited Oman and Russia. And the move is, a pretty clear indication that for the president, the blockade, the U.S. naval blockade, and the U.S. naval strikes have not moved Iran far enough in what it's willing to give up during negotiations. Trump's accused the Iranian regime of being in complete chaos, and that the proposals sent back reflected clear divisions within Iranian leadership. But publicly, Iran has pushed back a lot on this framing, even coordinating public media messages between Araghchi and Parliamentary Speaker Bakir Ghalibaf, who were both part of the negotiations in Pakistan earlier this month, insisting that all parties in Iran are together in their diplomatic efforts. And it's hard to tell exactly what's going on behind closed doors in Iran. But the one thing that's clear this week and from last week is that Iran's not really ready to give up its right to enrich uranium, at least not forever. Iran earlier this week, as it was reported, offered to completely lift its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which has been really central to the negotiations thus far, in exchange for a delay in negotiating the future of its nuclear program, which would essentially be trading one U.S. demand for another. Iran, as many listeners know, has closed the Strait of Hormuz for nearly 2 months, and 1/5 of the world's oil passes through that each year, and it's put a lot of pressure on global energy markets. This week, gas prices reached a new high since the start of the war, averaging at around $4.23 a gallon nationwide. And while lifting the blockade would be attractive domestically for Trump politically, it would also be kicking a pretty dangerous can down the road with the nuclear issue. There's no guarantee that Iran would agree to permanent nuclear restrictions once they restart negotiations over the program. And Trump and his allies have made getting Iran to agree to dismantle its nuclear program the centerpiece of their demands, along with limits to missiles, drones, and support for terror proxies. In addition, the president seems convinced that the U.S. naval blockade that it launched earlier this month is going to completely crush Iran economically and force them back to the negotiating table. I mean, he said earlier this week that Iran had told him explicitly that they're in a state of collapse. And while it's clear that Iran is suffering economically, including a further devaluation of its rial, the currency, and further devaluation of its oil revenue, Iran is convinced that the U.S. will break before they do when it comes to the economic pressure. And all that's to say really is that an off-ramp to the conflict is looking further and further away each day as both sides seem unwilling to cave to the economic pressure.
It's interesting, Vaughn, like this game of chicken that's going on economically in terms of who's going to cave first. Iran's betting that high gas prices here in the U.S. will put so much political pressure on the president that we have to make some concessions of our own on the U.S. side. We're betting we can cause them so much pain by limiting all exports, shutting down, the Iranian ports. I think one of the factors we kind of forget too often here is that Iran has proved recently it doesn't particularly care about its own people. I mean, we've seen them, at least reportedly, allegedly, according to the UN and other international observers, having murdered hundreds, thousands of their own people in demonstrations just a few months ago. And that's just one example of that. So I do think the cost benefit analysis in terms of how much stock you put in the well-being of your own people and the economic and even the physical safety of your own populations are just very, very different. So that's worth keeping in mind. The one thing you said that really jumped out to me, Vaughn, the messaging around the nuclear issue here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, again, just a few days ago, reiterated that that's central to what the U.S. sees this entire thing, and nuclear at the middle of it. So how do you sign off on some deal that doesn't include it in some way? Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was on Capitol Hill yesterday testifying to the House what was ostensibly a budget hearing, but of course was a lot about Iran. And he kind of got into it with Representative Adam Smith about this whole obliterated Iranian nuclear program, that phrase we heard after Operation Midnight Hammer. And of course, he kind of got caught in this rhetorical trap that administration officials keep getting themselves into, which is how is something obliterated, but then we went to war again and we're negotiating about it 6-7 months later. So the problem then becomes, I think, how do you get out of another military engagement, which would be the second after Operation Midnight Hammer, now Operation Epic Fury, 2 U.S. military engagements in Iran, and we come out of both of them and they still have a nuclear program that's up and running in some capacity and still have uranium, stockpiles of enriched uranium in some capacity. It's hard to sell that to the American people. It's hard to sell that if you're a Republican running for re-election in November and you're out on the campaign trail. So I don't know, from strictly a PR perspective, Vaughn, it seems like the administration's kind of between a rock and a hard place and how they're going to get out of this right now, even just solely from a messaging point of view.
That's absolutely the case. And, the cost too is going to come back. And that was a bit of probably the biggest bombshell that came out of the hearings that you're talking about yesterday. The $25 billion price tag, which, independent assessments aside, is still a lot of money. And that it's going to be really hard to sell to the American people, especially in the face of, as I said earlier, really, really high gas prices. And we're not to, in the wake of the Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine war levels yet, but we're getting there. And there really, like I said, is no sign of an off-ramp, no real light at the end of the tunnel, as we said. And adding to the chaos, the other thing on my radar, obviously, is OPEC developments with the UAE saying that the United Arab Emirates saying that they'll be leaving OPEC at the end of this month, starting in May. It's a major blow to the cartel, which, as many listeners probably know, they set production quotas for the world's largest oil producers, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. But the thing is, it's not entirely unexpected. The UAE has for years complained that OPEC's quotas have restricted the growth of its oil industry and that the organization has done a poor job at policing the production of other members, with Iraq specifically failing to adhere to OPEC's rules when it comes to how much oil it produces. The UAE's departure is likely to further weaken the power of the cartel, especially since the Emiratis are ranked 4th in total export value for its oil, behind only Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States. And it's number 2 in terms of OPEC members. Along with the Strait of Hormuz closure, the UAE's departure from OPEC could signal a growing distrust in Gulf energy exports as the region continues on an unstable path with the war continuing and everything. Still, the immediate effects of UAE's departure aren't really known yet. The news barely registered on international markets this week, but if the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, the UAE could dramatically increase its oil exports, unburdened by OPEC restrictions, which could push oil prices down and speed up global recovery, which I'm sure the president would love. But the UAE is gone. But with the UAE gone, OPEC now looks like an uneasy alliance between Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, the three largest oil producers left in the cartel. And that alliance could easily break down as the three nations look to balance their differing, geopolitical goals, both inside and outside the Middle East.
The future of OPEC. I mean, we'll see what that looks like a few months from now, but it's amazing, all these little subplots to the U.S. Iran war. Sometimes, as you said, things are so fast moving and there's so many different angles to this story that sometimes it's hard to process changes that are happening right in front of our eyes. And then later on, we'll look back at a vastly different world 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now and realize that the roots of that are kind of taking shape right now. In front of us with this war. So thank you for that, as always. One more thing I want to mention quickly, Vaughn, before we get to Tom Lyons. Our colleague in front of the show, of course, John Seward, this week dove into the idea of non-Earth imaging, essentially taking photos and mapping out capabilities and basically just about anything that's not on Earth, but in space, non-Earth imaging. So why would you do this if you're the United States? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, potentially. One of the big ones is potential orbital combat. I mean, this is more or less kind of an orbital or space-based version of reconnaissance, assessing the enemy's strengths, finding out exactly what they have, what their satellites are equipped with, what kinds of weapons they might have in space, what their tactics are. Can their satellites maneuver, or are they mostly stationary and stuck in one orbit? So it's just, the idea of space warfare. I mean, I remember covering the launch of the Space Force back in 2018 into 2019 when it officially formally launched, and you had skits on, Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert with people with, lightsabers and Star Wars references, making fun of, of the Space Force and of this idea of combat in space. And we're here. This is no longer theoretical. And I'll talk later in the show, in my thread of the week, not to give it away, but about Chinese AI companies using satellite imagery to track U.S. troop movements in the Middle East and potentially feed that back to the Iranians and their proxy groups to potentially target the U.S. and our positions in the Mideast. So space being used to aid adversaries and for the U.S. to aid us as well in terms of operations here on Earth, and then actual potential orbital combat and the preparations that go into it are real things right now and are kind of no longer this vastly, distant future that we talked about even a couple of years ago. So go check out my colleague John Seward's video to learn more about that because, we're entering uncharted territory, I think, to say the least on this.
Tom Lyons is a former CIA Directorate of Operations officer. He's an entrepreneur. He's a founder of the nonprofit 2430 Group, an organization focused on protecting U.S. critical infrastructure, countering malign foreign influence, and preventing economic espionage. In short, he's an interesting guy, and I'm flattered he agreed to come on the Threat Status podcast. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Guy, thank you, Ben. Great to meet you.
Thanks for coming on.
I forgot to mention that you're also a lawyer. You recently gave some pretty sobering testimony during 2 congressional hearings about the threat of Chinese spying on intellectual property of advanced American tech companies and other U.S. companies. We're going to talk about that here. But first, what is the 2430 Group? What does it do? And why should we care about it?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I try to keep the lawyer part real discreet. It's kind of like 2430, actually. 2430 has been a little bit in the shadows for the past couple of years, but what we do is we counter malign influence from state actors. So what that means is that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and primarily we educate groups. We educate businesses and NGOs and even government on things like intellectual property theft and economic espionage, industrial sabotage, and so forth. But what's unique about us is that we also take direct action to protect core infrastructure and defend against threats. So what that looks like is that on one day we might be talking to a board about how they can protect their long-term market share or their long-term revenue. How can they defend against economic espionage? But the next day we're working with the USG or Treasury or the government of Zambia to highlight research that we've done where we uncover, for example, Chinese front companies conducting operations that are going against critical infrastructure. And so we're not a policy organization. We're far more an outcome-focused organization.
Definitely want to get into the Chinese front companies aspect. I do want to ask you, though, you testified in March before the little-known House Small Business Committee, and you testified that the cost of Chinese intellectual property theft is at least 225 billion to 600 billion annually. First, how do you know that? And then second, what is being stolen?
Great questions. I think to start, that number comes, it's not our number, that number comes from an independent IP commission that was previously run by the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair, and former ambassador to China, Huntsman. And what I would say about those numbers are that they are incorrect. And I think that they woefully underrepresent the problem. We talk about up to $600 billion. FBI quotes that number and so forth. But that IP commission was set up to look at counterfeit goods crossing the border. And they looked at essentially a model for GDP. And they made an estimate around, we estimate that around 1% to 3% of GDP is lost in economic espionage. This wasn't a scenario in which they engaged with companies. And when you look at other studies that have done that, there's one that was somewhat recently done in Germany where they looked at and they talked to companies about how they experience theft and how much they lose. Germany came up with the number of around 300 million USD, so 260 some odd euro. And Germany is 1/6 of our size, right? So if you apply that model, then it's a far larger number. Now that study was looking at data theft writ large, but we can say that it's much more than is reported. And if I could comment just on what is being stolen, really, I think it's important for all of us to understand that the world has changed, and we're in the middle of the largest transfer of wealth and technology in human history. And most of it is going in one direction. It's going from the United States and its allies to the People's Republic of China. And it's not accidental. It's intentional. It is their policy. And it's been going on for decades. The PRC government is highly focused on reducing America's freedom of action, right? By attacking us in non-kinetic ways. So that's cyber, that's technology, that's talent recruitment, it's influence operations, supply chain dependency. And they want to make sure that if the day comes where there's ever a real confrontation over Taiwan or the South China Sea or over global order, the US is too entangled. We're too dependent. We're too compromised on their supply chain that they don't need to fire a shot because they already control our supply chain or our chips or what about the power in our grid. So with that background, they're truly going after industry level events. We talk about it in terms of, there's theft here and there's theft here, and DOJ prosecuted this person and that was successful. But the true cost is not individual cases. It's really measured in industries. I mean, we pioneered solar industry back in the day, and China now controls something like 80% of the market. What about lithium ion batteries? It's the same, where China dominates the global battery manufacturing and the EVs in the world. We don't really see the volume of Chinese electronic vehicles because they're banned in the US, but across the globe, it's like 50%. And it's the same case in wind turbines and commercial drone technology, telecommunications, steel, port cranes, pharmaceuticals. I could keep going here, but when and this is all in the past 20 years. This has all changed extremely recently, and so it is a massive issue, and it's the cumulative result of them identifying strategic industries and going after technology through every single available means.
Right. Tom, it's Ben Wolfgang. Thank you so much for coming on here. I have two kind of big picture 30,000 foot questions. And one is just, and this might sound very elementary to somebody in your position, but I think listeners probably are wondering about is how does it actually happen? I mean, are we talking about hacking? Are we getting, stealing stuff from somebody's email, or they had a bad password? Or is this somebody walking into a physical facility with a thumb drive and getting information, or all of the above? Like when we say IP theft, how does it actually kind of unwind on like a physical, tangible basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think people have trouble contextualizing it because it sounds so distant, IP theft. And I guess what I would do is to break this down, I would start with perhaps a misnomer. In the intelligence community, there was often kind of a joke, a reference to the difference between how Russia conducts espionage versus how the PRC conducts espionage and how the Americans conduct espionage. And you've probably heard this before, but there's always a reference to 1,000 grains of sand model on the Chinese system. And the joke was always that if the target was a beach and the sand on the beach, the Russians would send in frogmen in the middle of the night with buckets to collect the sand and bring it back to Moscow and redo the beach. And the Americans would observe from space the contours of the beach and the geography, and they would halo in some SEAL Team 6 guys, and the Chinese, for their part, would send in 1,000 benign, unassuming tourists, and everybody collects 1 grain of sand, and it's all reapplied back in Beijing. And that was always this misnomer that it was random. And I bring that up because it's not random at all. It starts at the top, and every 5 years, the Chinese Communist Party openly publishes a plan that identifies strategic industries that China intends to dominate. So these documents are not aspirational. They're performance mandates, that metrics against which their subordinate party officials, their state-owned enterprise executives, and their military leaders are evaluated and promoted. So they prioritize specific sectors. They start targeting. They will pass it over to ministries who identify which particular companies have the technology. Or if it needs to be developed indigenously, and then they start executing. And execution looks like they have more than 2,000 funds, both venture funds but also industrial funds, that will engage with U.S. companies, providing capital and so forth. They will coerce employees. If you're a PRC national, you're subject to the national intelligence law, which requires you to cooperate with their intelligence apparatus. So they can coerce employees and students and so forth. They will incentivize people to cooperate through contracts, social engineering, LinkedIn outreach. Do you want to do a side gig? Do you have you want to cooperate with a research product? It's extremely prestigious.
Yeah.
To the question of how a company experiences this, a company will get hit 4 or 5 different ways. They'll have favorable terms from a venture firm that approaches them. As an example, and that venture firm has an obligation to transfer technology. Perhaps I mentioned, an employee's approached by an outside offer. There's talent programs that are set up to specifically recruit Western engineers with the idea that they remain in place and they bring back proprietary technology. Of course, the PLA and MSS or associated hacking groups will look for vulnerabilities from that standpoint. So, and I think an underrated vector here is supply chain penetration as well. And we see from time to time companies who are providing a real service, a real software, a real capability, but it does more than what you think it does. And that is extremely hard to detect. And sometimes companies just don't care.
Tom, I think you've covered this to a certain degree, but I want to try to drill into it with even more context here. So House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence Chairman Rick Crawford and House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Brian Mast said in a statement recently, after a classified briefing with the CIA, NSA, State Department, and the Department of Energy on the impact of export controls on technology competition with China, that, quote, China is working to cheat and steal its way to winning through smuggling, distillation, and remote access of U.S. technology, end quote. So I have 2 questions. One, how, in your mind, do U.S. researchers and U.S. companies close these loopholes? Does the government set laws that just say you can no longer collaborate, period, with any Chinese counterparts or researchers, or you can't take VC or investment money from anybody in China? Is it something like that? And then my second question is, you in this podcast, and I think these lawmakers, Brian Mast and Rick Crawford, they make it sound like this is like a totally state-sponsored CCP spying operation. And what I want to know before we close with you is, do you have real evidence that it is? You mentioned the Ministry of State Security a minute ago. It is a Ministry of State Security or some kind of Chinese intel operation that's tied to the CCP that's actually directing this spying. Is that what you're saying?
It is, and I think I can take that one first because it's straightforward. We get the question a lot, and is this just corporate espionage? Is this what happened to the UK or to others in the past? And the answer is no. This is very much a planned and intentional effort. It's by the party. It's not by the MSS necessarily. The MSS is one tool that they have. The PLA is one tool. But that's been proven by DOJ. Cases like Subin, who was Subin was directing PLA hackers towards U.S. technology, and led to the theft of numerous aviation secrets. Yanjun Shu, who was that was a pretty big case. I think he was arrested in 2018, and he was a career MSS officer. He was coming out of the Jiangsu province of MSS, and he was a division level director. So MSS is involved. MSS is simply one tool, though. It is a whole of society effort, is how we talk about it, stemming from the party, not necessarily just the intel. And how do companies close the loop, or how does the industry close the loop? But it's a critical question, and I think one of the biggest things is that there's a lack of awareness. So people need to understand it. So thank you for having this podcast and digging into this issue. This is why we left government, because we saw that U.S. government was unable to do anything about this issue. People think that the CIA is going to come knock on their door and say, "Hey, by the way, you've got an insider who's stealing your proprietary tech." But that's not going to happen. It's, I'm laughing because we hear this, but it's just not how we work. We have authorities in place that prevent sharing at scale of information, unfortunately. And there's a respect and there's a rule of law between private sector and government. So government is not coming to your rescue on one side. And I think another big piece of this is that the infrastructure through which theft occurs, such as talent programs, all of that is legal. Venture firms, no problem. Like, you can have a venture firm, you can take investment from a Chinese fund. Yes, they're going to steal your IP, but until that theft occurs, FBI could care less. That's not an indictment of FBI. That's just our rule-based system. So we're dealing with a non-market-based adversary, and we treat them as a good faith, profit-oriented actor. And that is the disconnect right there. So, I think there needs to be disclosure rules. We talked about the Corporate Transparency Act years ago, and there's a lot of pushback on that. But I think there should be transparency and disclosure around entities who are receiving state funding from malign actors or who are under obligations, and it should be criminalized. So Charles Lieber was a case a few years ago. He was convicted, a Harvard professor, and he was receiving something like $50,000 a month and research funding and so forth through the talent programs. And it was not illegal up until the point where there was actual theft. And so we need to criminalize the receipt, the receipt of benefits from this infrastructure. We also need to mandate disclosure. We need to also, I think, change the incentive where companies currently don't care about this issue, because what we're talking about is a 3-year, 5-year issue. If I steal, the TPU designs from Google, okay, well, that's going to take me a little bit of time to commercialize that. It allows me to 100% skip R&D costs and learn from mistakes that they've already spent millions on. But I'm not going to turn around and commercialize that for a few years. And then I hit the market with a copycat state subsidized product. And that's when you start seeing the reflection. There might be another CEO in place,
Tom, my question for you is, why do we need to do this? Why does this actually matter in the grand scheme of 21st century great power competition? Why are we even talking about it? What's at stake here?
Yeah, I think this is it's a great point. It goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, was that what we're watching is the largest transfer of wealth in history, and if we allow this to continue to occur, the United States' ability to have freedom of action and to set the shape of the world order and so forth will go away. I think our quality of life, our living standards, and so forth will continue to implode, and so I think that there are a lot of people who are really mainly focused on getting that cheap goods from Temu or wherever, and that is leading to the issue of what we're dealing with. So we need to all recognize that this is an issue. We all have a part to play, and it will lead to a changed world, one that is far more authoritarian, one that is not market oriented, but is based on loyalty. And that's the opposite of what the U.S. represents.
Tom Lyons, one of the founders of the 2430 Group. Very interesting stuff. Thank you for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thank you guys. Much appreciated.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now. This week, as you all listen to the show, Vaughn, what do you have as your threat of the week?
Yeah, Ben, my threat of the week is the development today. We're recording this on Thursday, April 30th, is this growing spat between President Trump and German's Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And there's a public feud really over the perception of the Iran war. Chancellor Merz has had some relatively benign but still pretty prominent criticism of the way that the U.S. has enacted its war against Iran, telling students in Germany earlier this week that Iranian forces had embarrassed the U.S. on a global stage in its resistance efforts. And while Mr. Merz has maintained a relatively anti-Iran public stance and has insisted that Iran cannot obtain a nuclear weapon and has demanded that they reopen the Strait of Hormuz, President Trump does not knowably take kindly to public backlash, especially from other leaders. He's accused Merz earlier this week of wanting Iran to get a nuke. And then today he said that the U.S. is considering a, quote, possible reduction of troops in Germany in the near future. Now, analysts obviously have predicted that this is mostly bluster. Removing a significant amount of troops from Germany would be severely expensive and would really objectively be a strategic downgrade for the United States and Europe. I mean, German air bases have been used extensively in the war with Iran and are essential for global operations. But still, it's part of a trend of Donald Trump really hitting back at European leaders if they don't do exactly as he says when it comes to strategic operations. And it's also in line with a lot of his European-centric or NATO independence rhetoric that he's used over the past year, trying to get NATO to stand without U.S. economic and military support, especially during the Iran war.
It's hard to overstate the logistical footprint of the United States in Germany that, as you say, has just been built up over, pushing a century now at this point. So just kind of uprooting that, people whose families have lived there. That's not something that can be done overnight. So it's worth always keeping that in mind, of course. So thanks for that, Vaughn. My threat of the week builds off something I mentioned earlier in the show, and that's orbital combat and space warfare, but specifically about how Chinese AI companies are able to track U.S. troops in the Middle East via satellite imagery and potentially share that information with America's adversaries. Our colleague Bill Gertz wrote this week about how Chinese AI company Mizar Vision, which has publicly demonstrated its ability to track U.S. military assets and movements using satellite imagery, is part of a broader Chinese military plan focused on space. Because as Beijing develops more sophisticated and dangerous space-based weapons, they need a large number of satellites to support those weapons. And these satellites are being integrated into military operations and quote-unquote kill chains for advanced weapons that have been observed practicing the actual targeting of U.S. warships, airfields, ports, and other key military sites. Now, What's interesting here, of course, is that in the era of so much open source information and tracking data, there are plenty of US and other Western European companies that have a lot of this same satellite imagery too. It's actually not that hard. I mean, you can, whether you're looking for a missing airplane or a missing ship or anything virtually on Earth's surface or in the water at this point, you can find satellite imagery out there that gives you a pretty detailed look at it. But the difference is that these US and Western companies have been withholding a lot of that satellite imagery related to troop movements in the Middle East. China and its companies are not. They're publicly sharing it. And of course, that makes it into the hands of adversaries like Iran. So did this help Iran target U.S. positions? Did it help them shoot down a couple of American aircraft a few weeks ago? So I don't know the answer to that. But as we mentioned earlier, space is introducing a whole lot of new complications and capabilities into warfare, and this is one of them. And that's why it's my threat of the week. And before we go, as promised, Jason Sickels, the director of threat status, is with us here. Jason, somehow this is the first time you've been on the show. Thanks for being here. I understand you've got a major announcement you want to share with all of our listeners.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Look, I'm hiding in the shadows between you and Guy. You do such a great job. But you know this, Guy knows this, our team knows this, but we've been working on an event called IndoPAC for some time now. And we announced this today in the Washington Times and on threat status. You've probably seen the papers around Capitol Hill, the Pentagon. But this event was definitely the genesis of some of the conversations that Guy had with Admiral Caudle, Chief of Naval Operations. We're going to focus in on shipbuilding, on autonomy, and on command and control. And so we've got 3 panels. We have 2 keynote addresses. The great Senator Todd Young from Indiana is going to deliver a keynote. He is the author of the Ships for America Act, so we're excited to have his participation. We're building out the panels and the rest of the keynotes, but this is going to be really a great conversation. You know, the Navy really is at a inflection point, and shipbuilding is the prime focus of the CNO, and we're going to be real happy to host this, and it's going to be at the U.S. Navy Memorial, which is a great venue. So we're very excited, and if anybody would like information, we're happy to explain what this event's all about. But you guys have really been working on some of the key speakers, and this is going to be great.
It's just so amazing, the issues you just mentioned, everything in the Indo-Pac, shipbuilding, all this. So many issues are kind of wrapped up in this, and it really is sort of the center of that U.S. national security strategy right now, and is involved in some way, shape, or form with just about everything that we talk about on this show. So it's going to be a great event. We're very much looking forward to it. I'm honored, of course, to be a part of it, and thank you, Jason, for all the hard work that you have done and are doing and will continue to do to make it a reality here over the next few weeks. So thank you for that, Jason. Big thanks to Vaughn Cockayne, of course, and a huge thanks to our guest, Tom Lyons, this week on the show. But most of all, thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.